took that which I love. So I will take from you everything you have, and everything you have ever been. 1 year.
The first season of Castlevania took a lot of people by surprise. Far from a basic adaptation, it contained some spectacular writing, fantastic acting, and some of the most graphic animated violence this side of Berserk.
Pick him up. Take him back to your church. Don't bother this man or his people again.
So in preparation for the excellent-looking second season, join me for a trip through the Castlevania storyline. We're going to go through some of the highlights of the franchise as we try and decide once and for all, who was the greatest Belmont? Before we start, let's lay down some ground rules. This competition is specifically for members of the Belmont clan. Sorry Alucard fans, he's simply not eligible for this one. Additionally, we're looking at the full-blooded Belmonts only, so characters like John Morris are also not going to be in here. Finally, fair warning, there are spoilers ahead for the Castlevania storyline, some of which may also apply to the upcoming season on Netflix. Now we've got that out of the way, let's meet our contestants. Leon Belmont. The story of the Belmont clan begins with Leon Belmont in the 11th century. He was one of the fiercest and most respected knights in the realm, fighting for the church and slaying heretics in God's name alongside his friend, the master tactician Matthias. This all changed when he received news that his fiancée Sarah had been kidnapped by a vampire named Walter Bernhard. Unable to convince the church to sanction official action, Leon broke from the ranks and travelled to face Walter on his own. Leon's claim to fame is his official position as the catalyst for the ongoing Castlevania storyline. In Lament of Innocence, we not only get to see the birth of the monster who would go on to become Dracula, but we also finally get to see the creation of the Belmont's most important weapon. Upon meeting Rinaldo Gandolfi at the start of the game, Leon is gifted with the Whip of Alchemy.
Take this with you. It will help you against monsters.
Unfortunately, the weapon is ineffective against Walter, and Sarah is bitten and tossed aside. After realizing that she could not be saved, Sarah sacrificed herself to help enchant the Whip of Alchemy, turning it into the vampire killer. Eventually, Leon is able to return to the castle and use a newly empowered weapon to slay Walter, revealing the true villain of the game to be Matthias, driven mad by the death of his wife.
Matthias? You abandoned humanity?
That's right. By becoming a vampire, I obtained eternal life. That was my goal. It was my revenge against God!
As a game, Lament of Innocence is a bit underwhelming. Underneath the trappings of the franchise, the core gameplay is fairly bland and cannot touch the top-tier action games on the PlayStation 2 like Devil May Cry and God of War. Leon is an interesting character, and the game's events are a reasonably clever start to the whole Castlevania storyline. However, I can't help but think it would have been best if the actual origins of the whip had been kept ambiguous. Additionally, Leon doesn't exactly have the best track record throughout this game. He is humiliated by the main antagonist at the midway point, is forced to sacrifice his one true love to power his weapon, and even allows Matthias to escape at the end of the game. With all this in mind, it's hard to put him on the same level as some of his descendants, when they were at least able to seal Dracula away for a period of time. Still, there is something to be said for being the first of the Belmont line, so Leon deserves to be in the conversation at the very least. Trevor Belmont. Probably considered the first real Belmont by many people, Trevor Belmont is one of the most beloved characters in the franchise. With the character represented in a variety of games, we have a fairly good idea of Trevor's strengths and flaws. Dracula returned in the 15th century, with his dark armies descending on Wallachia and slaughtering innocents without mercy. The Church initially tried to resist Dracula's armies on their own terms, with a secret team in particular being sent to slay the Count himself. Unfortunately, they were not successful, and the country continued to be plagued by the Vampire Lord's monsters. During this period, the Belmont clan had been exiled by the Church for fear of their otherworldly powers.
Vlad Dracula, an old family. The capital? All run by the great houses, and they're not even the worst. The Belmonts? We should have killed all the Belmonts.
Returning to the clan with their hat in their hands, they begged for assistance in driving back Dracula's hordes. Trevor returned to Wallachia, finding a variety of allies along the way who all had their own reasons for wanting to see the end of Dracula. In the end, Trevor was successful in subduing Dracula and bringing a relative sense of peace back to the land. Until the events of Curse of Darkness, at least.
Are you not Trevor Belmont, the one who defeated Lord Dracula?
That I am, though I did not fight alone. There were many brave warriors beside me. And your name, sir?
Hector.
Hector. I shall remember that name.
Trevor's legacy had a huge impact on the Belmont bloodline and future events in the Castlevania series. His actions served not only to save the land in his era, but also tie the Belmont clan to some of their strongest allies over the following generations, including Cypher Belnades and Alucard. Trevor has been a significant character in the series, going as far to becoming the central figure in the new Netflix series. Castlevania 3 was also the earliest mainline game in the canon for a long time until Lament of Innocence arrived in 2003. Whilst Trevor didn't actually slay Dracula permanently, his record is formidable, and he set the stage for future descendants to follow his example. Christopher Belmont. Christopher Belmont is not the most well-known Belmont, but he has an interesting background that should not be disregarded. Over a couple of decades at the end of the 1500s, he managed to defeat Dracula not once, but twice. That kind of success is nothing to sniff at. A century after Trevor defeated Dracula, Castlevania returned and the Count rose again. As this generation's Belmont, it was Christopher's duty to assault the castle and attempt to seal Dracula away again. In his initial adventure, he was able to reduce the castle to rubble. Unfortunately, Dracula was able to escape, to recover and discover new ways to torment Christopher. A couple of decades later, the Count struck directly at his foe by kidnapping Christopher's son, Soliu. At the same time, 4 elemental castles appeared, each led by a terrifying guardian. Christopher destroyed these other castles, causing Castlevania itself to appear. Unfortunately, Dracula had used his dark influence to pull Soliu to his side. Father and son were forced to battle, tormenting Christopher's soul and bringing him precariously close to the edge. Luckily, he was able to overcome his son and block Dracula's control over him. Christopher then moved on to Dracula, destroying him and sealing him away once more. Whilst Christopher is arguably one of the most successful Belmonts, he is also one of the least interesting. His games were initially handheld titles that were pale reflections of their console brethren. The best game by far to feature him was Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth for WiiWare, but barely anyone had the chance to play that game, and with the closure of the Wii Shop channel in 2019, it's likely for that to continue to be the case. Sorry, Christopher, you are destined to be the forgotten middle child of the Belmont clan. Simon Belmont. Simon is probably the Belmont most commonly associated with the Castlevania series. As the protagonist of Castlevania and its sequel, Simon was not the first Belmont in the timeline, but he was the first Belmont that players were exposed to. A 100 years after his defeat by Christopher Belmont, Dracula returned thanks to the efforts of a dark cult who performed the resurrection on Easter Day. Simon was the next descendant to wield the vampire killer, so he journeyed to Castlevania and attempted to slay the Count. Whilst he was successful in causing Castlevania to crash back down to the ground, he was not as successful when it came to Dracula himself. Suffering a wound during the battle, he was cursed, and found his health quickly fading over the following years. The events of Castlevania 2 saw him attempting to lift his curse, first by resurrecting Dracula, then killing him again and burning the remains. His victories saw Simon gain notoriety in the region, and helped the Belmont clan to regain the trust of the people. He was seen as a hero, and his bloodline was slowly welcomed back into the general populace with open arms. The Belmonts had been pushed away by local communities for years due to general ignorance of the supernatural powers that they wielded, so changing their mindset was perhaps Simon's most important contribution to the Belmont legacy. It doesn't matter which incarnation of Simon we're talking about, the original barbarian design, the updated red-headed look, or this thing. Simon is one of the first, one of the strongest, and definitely one of the greatest to ever wield the whip. Welcome to the intermission.
Simon Belmont, this is your night!
How do I look? Is my hair alright?
Before we continue through the Castlevania timeline, let's take a look at some honourable mentions. Gabriel Belmont. The protagonist of the 2010 series reboot, Gabriel was a fascinating character, and the catalyst for a very clever twist of the traditional Castlevania storyline. This was partially helped by some excellent voice acting, courtesy of Robert Carlyle.
I can show you many things, many pleasures.
Your empty promises mean nothing to me. You and your brothers have betrayed us all. You are the reason why the world is in darkness.
You are a fool, Gabriel.
Lords of Shadow saw Gabriel follow a path of constant betrayal and lies in order to slowly but surely accept his fate. The first Lords of Shadow game in particular was excellent, and was extremely refreshing after a series of average 3D games, and relatively familiar 2D Metroidvanias. I particularly liked the move back towards a gothic European art style, and away from the generic anime one that the series had started moving towards. Unfortunately, Lords of Shadow is a separate story, and not part of the traditional canon. Plus, Gabriel probably belongs on the list of best monsters, not best Belmonts. Sonia Belmont. Possibly the most unlucky character in the franchise, Sonia really has to be left out of this particular list through no fault of her own. She was the star of Castlevania Legends, a Game Boy Color title that was like a highly refined version of Castlevania The Adventure. At the time, it was also the earliest game in the Castlevania timeline, positioning Sonia as both the first female protagonist in the series, as well as the first Belmont, period. However, this game was sadly taken out of the series canon, and relegated to a side story in 2005 by Konami, as it didn't fit in with the direction that Konami planned to take the series. The other game she was supposed to star in was the cancelled Dreamcast title, ironically named Castlevania Resurrection. Poor Sonia. She just could never quite catch a break. And now, back to the official timeline. Juste Belmont. Juste grew up in a village founded after Simon had previously defeated Dracula and earned back the trust of the local communities. As such, he was the first Belmont in years to have been accepted from birth as a potential hero, rather than treated as an outcast. He was trained from a young age in preparation for Dracula's return. The challenge, however, came in an unexpected manner. After returning home injured from a training mission, Juste's childhood friend Maxim led him to a castle where their mutual friend Liddy was being held. After exploring the area, Juste learned that Maxim had become jealous of the Belmonts and had collected Dracula's remains in order to prove his own worth as a vampire hunter. Unfortunately, this had caused him to come under Dracula's thrall, and in the end, Maxim was responsible for the entire situation, including Liddy's kidnapping. Look, let's be honest here. Juste is definitely a bottom-tier Belmont. His design is a bit of a strange in-between of Trevor and Alucard, but does not quite hit the mark. He is also one of the only Belmonts to not actually fight Dracula. Instead, Juste's final challenge is simply to destroy the Dracula Wraith, which is a pale reflection of the true Dark Lord. Like Christopher, he isn't even significant enough to warrant an invitation to Castlevania Judgement, which is damning in and of itself. Unfortunately, his game is almost as forgettable as he is, with the added bonus of some truly awful sounding music. It's not even the melodies that are bad, but the reproduction of the instruments is some of the worst on the handheld. With all of this together, it's hard to see Juste as anything more than a bottom-of-the-barrel Belmont. Richter Belmont. Long considered the strongest Belmont of all time, Richter's legacy contains some of the highest highs of any of his peers. Unfortunately, along with these came some of the lowest lows, leaving a black mark on the clan that would take generations to remove. In the 18th century, Dracula was resurrected again. This time it was a dark priest named Shaft who was responsible. Immediately after being resurrected, Dracula commanded his armies to attack Richter's village and kidnap several women, including Richter's girlfriend Annette and aspiring vampire hunter Maria. Richter performed his duty and assaulted Dracula in his castle, slaying the Count and bringing an end to the danger for another generation. Or so he thought. Unfortunately, Shaft was able to exert his influence over Richter, twisting his courage into a naked ambition for recognition through battle. In Richter's mind, the Belmonts existed solely to battle Dracula. With his battle over, he felt empty and unfulfilled. This caused Richter to attempt to resurrect Dracula with the intention of securing his legacy as the greatest hunter of all time through never-ending battle. Alucard had to intervene, climbing the castle and snapping Richter out of his haze. Although Alucard was able to prevent Shaft's plans for Dracula's return, the damage was done. Not only was Richter left humiliated and ashamed of his role in the events of Symphony of the Night, but the Belmont bloodline itself was stained. They were forced to pass the vampire killer on, with the whip eventually being wielded by members of the Morris clan. It would be more than 100 years before a Belmont would use the whip again. Whilst Richter is undeniably powerful, he is also responsible for some of the darkest periods in the history of the Belmont clan. If not for Alucard, Richter could have actually been responsible for the resurrection of Dracula. Additionally, it was Richter's hubris that allowed for Shaft to play with his mind in the first place, almost severing the connection between the Belmonts and the vampire killer in the process. It's hard to genuinely put Richter in the same league as some of his peers as a result, despite featuring in some of the best games in the entire franchise. Julius Belmont. The man who finally put an end to Dracula, Julius is likely the most gifted Belmont in the canon timeline. In the Battle of 1999, otherwise known as the Demon Castle War, Julius was a key player in the attack on Dracula's castle. His allies managed to seal the castle away inside of a solar eclipse, allowing Julius to finally destroy the Count without him being able to resurrect himself. Of course, this victory was somewhat lessened a few years later when Soma Cruz came on the scene as the reincarnation of Dracula, but Julius can still claim the honour of the most complete single victory over the Count. Julius is supposedly the most powerful Belmont of all time, which his accomplishments reflect. As the first Belmont in generations to wield the vampire killer against Dracula, it was Julius who restored the purity of the Belmont's reputation. When he appears in games set after the Demon Castle War, he is well into his 50s and still continuing to fight demons, monsters, and cultists. His storied legacy was not just a single accomplishment, but decades of them, one after the other. The only real knock against Julius is that we never actually got to see the Demon Castle War in a game. All we have are hints and echoes of the event in other titles. It may not be entirely fair to Julius, but sometimes you just need to see these things with your own eyes before you can give full credit. Nevertheless, he should be considered right up there with the best of the Belmont line. Obviously, it's very hard to say who is the definitive best Belmont. In my mind, it comes down to a combination of success in the storyline, as well as the quality of the games that they starred in. I'd say that we can write off Leon, Christopher, and Juste immediately due to their games being fairly mediocre. Now this next part may be controversial, but I'd also write off Richter because of his role in the events of Symphony of the Night and the effect it had on the Belmont bloodline. That leaves Trevor, Simon, and Julius. Each have their own strengths and weaknesses, to the point where it feels arbitrary to try and select a winner from the three. This is one of the strengths of the Castlevania series though. None of the main characters are perfect examples of a traditional hero. Each Belmont is flawed in some way, showing the humanity at their core despite their otherworldly abilities. Hopefully this has inspired you to go back and play through some of the games in this classic series before you settle down to continue watching Trevor's adventures on Netflix. Whether you're a classic Castlevania fan like me, or a Metroidvania devotee, there is an incredible number of fantastic games for you to choose from.